Well, good afternoon, everyone. Please make sure that your phones are on silent. And it is time, so we should begin. Now, the next couple of weeks of your CVSP course will be covering material that includes two major texts. The first is the text of Ghazali, and the second is an anonymously written text referred to as the Ikhwan Safa. But before we dive into these two texts and I give you an overview of these two texts, I'd like to go back a little, because when we were looking at Augustine, we were really in a very different political world, the world of the Roman Empire, which begins to collapse as of the 5th century, and by the 7th century had very much been removed from the North Africa and Syria region, and take a look at the beginnings of a new civilization that in many ways is different, but in many other ways is very similar. And so what we're going to look at first is to see how the Islamic civilization in the 9th century leads to a sort of a culture and a world that produces someone like Ghazali, perhaps one of the greatest intellectuals of the Islamic world, just as Augustine could be considered as one of the greatest thinkers and theologians of the early Christian world. If we look at this slide here, we have two individuals, one dressed in Islamic attire, Middle Eastern attire, and the second dressed in rather more European attire. We have an instrument being played by both individuals. On the left you have a lute, and on the right you have a oud. And I think this is a wonderful example of what Al-Andalus produced in terms of a harmony between the Abrahamic religions that we are considering in this course, and at the same time a harmony and an efflorescence of very many different cultures coming together, particularly the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish Abrahamic cultures. And so Al-Andalus will of course be one of the topic areas that you will be covering after Ghazali and Ikhwan Safa. But this encounter between Christians and Muslims in Al-Andalus in southern Spain was not the first time that such an encounter had taken place, because from the very beginnings of Islam, the encounter was in fact taking place. And the Quran is a very good example of religions in dialogue, because we have mention in the Quran of both Christians, Jews, and others, but mainly a dialogue between Islam and Christianity that begins and is witnessed by the Quran itself, the founding text of Islam. And so if we move into take a look at Arabia and the Near East in the 6th century, we see that what we have is not only a pagan Arabia, but we have many different cultures surrounding that Arabia, and within that peninsula as well, you have both Christianity and Judaism, as well as pagan Arab religions. To the east, you see the Persian Empire. You have the great Persian civilization there encroaching. You have Arab tribes allied to the Persian Empire, the Lakhmids or the Manadhira, referred to in Arabic. In the west, you have the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, with its own buffer state of Arab tribes, known as the Ghasasina, the Ghassanids. And so what you have is that there are also Arab tribes that have been Persianized in many ways, or Romanized in many ways, as well as the traditional view of Arab tribes in central Najd. But look at the south. You have the Himyarite kingdom, led for long periods of time by a Jewish king. Look at in Eastern Arabia, you can see that the Persian Gulf that the Eastern Arabian coast was under Persian control. And in particular, you had very important centers of Syriac Christianity there. And so the encounter is not only ideological or religious, but also cultural and linguistic. We find, for example, many, many different languages and scripts throughout Arabia. Some examples from North Arabia: Safayitic. In the east, you have Hassayitic. In the Hijaz, various different scripts going on there. And in the south, Southern Thamudic. And on top of that, on top of all these Semitic languages that many of which are not entirely deciphered, you have an undercurrent of Aramaic languages throughout northern Arabia and eastern Arabia, under the guise of the Nabatean kingdom, which was the trading center of the time. And in the north, in northern Syria, you have another very strong Aramaic dialect known as Syriac. And you can also see that Arabic was not contained in Arabia. Arabic exists, and its earliest attestations are to be found throughout Syria as well as northern Arabia. So we must really think very differently about what the idea of an Arabic that is contained within an Arabia that is empty of all other cultures and religions. In fact, Christianity, Judaism, and early Islam were in direct contact and dialogue with each other in the Hijaz area. Here we have some examples of early Arabic script that is developing out of other scripts. In this case, we have an example of the Aramaic script being of the particular Nabatean branch being developing into the Arabic script. So you have the Arabic language, but no script. This changes completely with the spread of the Umayyads. The Umayyads was the first great Islamic dynasty that, through its conquests, led to a geographical entity that ranged from as far west as Al-Andalus, where that particular drawing that we saw, that miniature painting that we saw, comes from, in Spain, all the way to Central Asia. Now you can imagine that an empire of this size was incorporating many, many different cultures and civilizations, and at the same time developing its own core culture, and driven by the Arabic language. Now, during the Umayyad period, you begin to see a translation movement beginning to emerge, and the most important example of this translation movement was Ibn al-Muqaffa. If you've heard of Kalila wa Dimna, then the animal stories of Ibn al-Muqaffa were in fact part of a wider translation movement that was taking place in the Umayyad period. And this is really reflecting an interest in other cultures, other civilizations. In the case of Kalila wa Dimna, it was a translation from the Sanskrit text, the Panchatantra, into Middle Persian, and finally into Arabic through Ibn al-Muqaffa's translation. So we see then that what we have is the beginnings of a globalized civilization, a universal civilization, where in terms of the Islamic outlook, we have the understanding that other cultures and other religions are part and parcel, or are incorporated, we might say, within the wider Islamic civilization. One word that has recently been used is Islamicate. That is to say that it is not a purely Islamic civilization in the pure religious sense of the word, but that Islamic civilization also incorporated and included other religions, and as well as translations of and interest in other texts. We come now to the Abbasids. Now the Abbasids significantly increased the size of the geographical size of the Islamic Empire, but what they also did was they built on many of the institutions that the Umayyads had already installed or put into place. In the 9th century, Baghdad, which was the capital of the Abbasid Empire, was the center, again, of a very prosperous, brilliant city. It was a prosperous and brilliant city, the center of a globalized civilization. What the Abbasids did in the 9th century was that they began to systematize fields of learning that had been established already under the Umayyads. Now, in terms of Islamic sciences, the fields of learning that they systematized was the hadith, was law, was Quran commentary, tafsir. And these were considered to be the core fields in Islamic sciences. What does systematization mean? It means putting them in order. The hadith, for example, would have been established. What was established for the hadith was a transmission line, for example, to verify that the hadith was correct, that the hadith was true. You also have hadith manuals now, so all the sayings of the Prophet were reorganized under themes, under headings, under titles. In the same way, law, or fiqh in Arabic, was also built based on the principles, the usul, that is, that one should not simply think of particular specific rules, but that there was a principle behind these rules, which would then allow for further legal judgments to be made based on the principles rather than the specific laws. And in the same way, the Quran commentaries also were systematized by thematizing and basing the commentaries on particular topics. In the Abbasid period, you also have a systematization of non-Islamic sciences, we could call them, under the umbrella of adab. Now, adab is a very difficult word to translate. But under the non-Islamic sciences, we might think of adab as the CS of the time. That is, that it should be, that adab was a broad education. in religion, in history, in poetry, in arithmetic, in calligraphy, in many fields, that adab was an adib was someone who had a broad knowledge of very many different topic areas and was able to function and talk and analyze all these various, and write, of course, adab, on many different topics. So that was the broad knowledge that was valued, very valued at the time. What was the principle behind adab? It was the idea that there is wisdom outside of religion too, that not all wisdom lies within religion. And of course this connects with the idea that you have this universalized, globalized civilization that Baghdad is the capital of. Adab also focuses on reason, that reason is as important as religious faith. So again, we have perhaps the balance between reason and religion. That is not to say that religion is not reasonable, but that there is reason outside of religious faith. That a true education should be a universal education, meaning an awareness of the histories of other civilizations, past civilizations, other religions, other cultures, other languages. That was really prioritized in Abbasid Baghdad. That although specialization is desirable, a general knowledge and a broad knowledge is more important. And so what you have in the concept of adab is the idea that broad knowledge rather than specialization was something desirable. But under that broad knowledge, under that umbrella, you do have specializations. And what you also have then is a systematization of various fields of learning, such as theology, kalam, philosophy, falsafa, natural science, and ilm al-tabi'a, grammar and literary theory, universal history, geography, Sufism or mysticism. So there were specializations. You could be a grammarian, you could be a historian, you could be a geographer. That would be your specialization. That is what we call in Arabic ilm. But the adib was always somehow above the specializations. That he was able to talk across the board made him extremely valuable, and he was given the respect as a result. In the 9th and 10th centuries, with this globalized civilization of the Abbasids, you have a new interest in translation. And this is, of course, building on what the Umayyads had recently, or in the 7th century, initiated. What we call this in the Abbasid period is Bayt al-Hikmah. However, this was not a building or a particular institution. It was more an idea, an interest in the translation of Indian culture, literature, Greek, particularly Greek, philosophy, science, and also literature from other languages. Now, the individuals that established this movement were a reflection of the world in which, the kind of world that Baghdad was. It was multicultural and multi-religious. Who was patronizing these translations? Well, it was the caliphs themselves. caliphs such as Harun al-Rashid and al-Ma'mun, his son, really backed this translation movement. Individuals such as Hunayn ibn Ishaq, there you can see at the beginning of the 9th century, are considered to have been some of the founding fathers of the translation movement. Now, they were Syriac native speakers and had been educated in the Syriac schools of Gundi Shapur, Nisibis, Edessa. They had received training in Greek, philosophy, logic, and had begun to translate these Greek texts and scientific and arithmetic texts into Syriac. So there was already a library there of translations that was at the disposal of the Syriac scholarly community, and that is why they were at the heart of a translation movement from Greek to Syriac and then from Syriac to Arabic. And being at the heart of this translation movement was also very of great interest, of great value, not only intellectually, but on a very financial level, because there was a lot of money in it. Translations for the caliphs were paid in gold, and so if you translated a big book, it was literally weighed in the scale, and you were given the equivalent of that weight in gold. So it was the Silicon Valley of the time in many ways, and there was competition as to who could translate what and in the best possible Arabic. And that was very important, of course, that the Arabic should be comprehensible. Now, anyone who's tried to read Plato or Aristotle, and you have tried to read Plato and Aristotle, know that Greek philosophy is extremely difficult to understand. And therefore, being able to translate it means you need to understand it at least first. And so these translators were not simply translators, they were also philosophers in their own right. They were also scientists in their own right, and were able to explain and teach what they had been translating. And that was really part of the process. It wasn't to translate and put these things on the shelves. It was to translate and retranslate and understand and teach the various sciences. In particular, the logical writings of Aristotle were of particular interest and importance because Aristotle's logical writings were the foundation of the educational institutions of the time as they had been in the previous centuries, in the pre-Islamic centuries. So anyone who wanted to specialize needed first to learn logic. And it made sense, therefore, that these should be translated into Arabic in order to establish the first schools of science and the specializations that we had been talking about required that philosophers and scientists have the logical foundations that would enable them to write in the various fields that they did. Notice in red Al-Kindi. Now, Al-Kindi is of great interest because he's considered to be the philosopher of the Arabs, Faylasuf al-Arab. Notice that he is part of this translation movement. And his role was extremely important because he was a bridge between the translators and the caliphs. He was also very important as an editor of the Arabic translations. He made sure that the Syriac scholars were translating these texts into good, comprehensible Arabic. He was also extremely influential in his own right because he wrote some of the earliest philosophy in Arabic. And others such as Ishaq bin Hunayn and Thabit ibn Qurra, all from various backgrounds: Christian, Al-Kindi, Muslim, Arabic, Syriac, Greek and Persian, were all part and parcel of the Baghdad cosmopolitan world that we are looking at. After this initial period, another school of learning emerges in Baghdad. It is the school of Aristotelian philosophy. Again, we have individuals in this particular school of Aristotelian philosophy. So here we have a period in which those texts of Aristotle that I was just telling you about were not only being translated, but now were being studied, were being analyzed, and were being discussed, as well as being taught. The founder of this particular school, Abu Bishr Matta bin Yunus, again a Syriac of the Church of the East, a native speaker of Syriac with Greek education and Arabic too, so he was trilingual. And we have many of these trilingual scholars at the heart of the translation movement, but also at the heart of what turns out to be a movement of philosophy at the heart of the capital. Al-Farabi is of great interest too. I have him in red there, known as the second teacher, Al-Muallim al-Awwal, the first teacher, of course, being Aristotle, and that is to give you an indication of his great importance in terms of Islamic and Arabic philosophy. Al-Farabi was of Persian background, but wrote in Arabic, which was the scientific language of the day, as well as the language of the Islamic sciences that I was telling you about. Now, what's interesting is that Al-Farabi was Abu Bishr Matta's student, and then Yahya bin Adi was Al-Farabi's student. So there was also an educational, if you like, teacher-student relationship between these individuals, as well as the teamwork in translating and teaching Aristotelian philosophy. How does Ibn Sina fit into all this? Avicenna being one of the greatest, if not the greatest philosopher in Islamic and Arabic civilization, comes almost at the end of this whole movement, translation movement. And the great philosophers and the scientists of the 10th century would have been very interested in the kind of translations that had been undertaken of on Aristotle, and as a result producing some of these great works such as the Book of Healing and the Canon of Medicine. Without the translations, that would never have been possible. Without the translation movement, that would not have been possible either. So the great philosophers such as Ibn Sina and the great scientists such as Abu Rayhan al-Bayruni, for example, of that century, of the 10th and 11th centuries, would not have emerged without that long translation movement that had rendered all these texts accessible to them. Now, in terms of Al-Ghazali, again, we jump a century, and we see that Al-Ghazali is coming at the end of the political hegemony of the Abbasids. So at the time of Ghazali, the Abbasid period had begun to fragment politically, and so we had the Umayyads were in Spain, survived in Spain. You had another dynasty, the Fatimids, controlling Egypt, and you had the Seljuks, which were a military group running the political affairs of the central Islamic lands. So the Abbasid Caliph was more a nominal figure than a particularly influential figure politically or militarily. Al-Ghazali was born in Persia, in eastern Persia, in a place called Tus in 1058, as you can see. He was an orphan and was educated probably by a Sufi scholar or a local teacher. He would have learned the Islamic sciences, those that I've just referred to. He would have been taught Quran, jurisprudence, and theology, and then further studies under Al-Juwayni, who was a prominent scholar of the time. Now, in terms of a career, he had a brilliant career. Briefly, he works for, after his teacher Al-Juwayni dies, he works for the court of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuks, and after which he is appointed in 1091 head of the madrasa or school, the Nizamiya madrasa or school, which was the most important seminary in Baghdad. What was Ghazali's interest? Well, so Ghazali also studies philosophy, but he does so independently. His education is in the Islamic sciences, as I have mentioned. Now, Ghazali had a big problem with the philosophers, with that philosophical movement that I was showing you, that was both translating and teaching philosophy. He thought that that was one of the major factors for the fragmentation, the decline of Islamic doctrine. And at the same time, as an Ash'arite, he believed that the philosophers were wrong in many ways. Now, Ash'arites were a theological group of theologians. His teacher Al-Juwayni was an Ash'arite, and they had a very strong belief that in occasionalism, and occasionalism is really to say that God is able to freely do whatever he likes. And that sort of makes sense, doesn't it? Unless you are Avicenna, who believes that if God necessarily exists, and he makes the argument that God must and necessarily must exist, then everything that God does must be necessary too. Well, Ghazali disagrees with this, and if we think of the concept of physical causation, we get a good idea of how they differed. So if I bring a flame towards a piece of cotton, we think in terms of physical causation, what's going to happen to the cotton? It's going to burn, yes. And this physical causation, of course, is what the philosophers would promote, would underline. However, the Ash'arites, as theologians who want to bring God centrally into the process, would say that, in fact, the cotton does burn, but it's not because of causation, it's because God makes it burn. So this, if you like, is an example of the way in which necessity is, in which God is brought into the formula of physical causation. In the incoherence of the philosophers, as you can see there, Al-Ghazali attacks the philosophers on three major issues. The first issue is the eternity of the world. Now, the philosophers believed that the world was eternal, based on the scientific fact that matter cannot be destroyed, and therefore the world is eternal, matter is eternal. On the contrary, Ghazali contends with this and says that God created the world, and therefore philosophy is wrong and un-Islamic in this regard. Secondly, the philosophers believe that God does not know particulars. He knows the generalities. Yes, he knows the big picture, but the little details God does not know. Again, Ghazali objects to this because of the fact that God must know everything. And finally, the philosophers, such as Avicenna, did not believe in a physical resurrection. And this, of course, is contra all three, I think, or at least Christianity and Islam, the two main monotheistic religions believe in a bodily resurrection. So therefore, in the incoherence of the philosophers, as an Ash'arite and also using philosophy to counter philosophy. Ghazali really lays down an anti-philosophical trend that is picked up by many theologians of his time. And theologians of the time, Ash'arites in particular, would have backed each other up on this in this regard. The point at which Ghazali starts to self-question is an important moment, and that takes place in 1095, where after which he writes Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, the text that we will be looking at, Deliverance from Error. Now this text is really another autobiography. Just as you have been looking at the autobiography of Augustine, so too we have here an autobiography that is underlining religious uncertainty, that is highlighting religious uncertainty in the process by which one can reach certainty. Certainty and truth, as we saw in Augustine, was a major headache for Ghazali. How can I be sure that what I know is true? How can I be sure that I know what I know? Questions like that drove him bonkers. And really one of the things that he comes to conclude in Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal is that just as the senses are verified by reason, meaning if I see a mirage in the desert, yes, that is the sense of sight. Reason can actually fix that. It can verify whether it is a reality or an illusion. And so just as that is the case when it comes to the senses, so reason too needs to be verified somehow. There needs to be some external confirmation of reason. How do I know that what I know is true? And that, of course, does not really have an answer. Okay, I reason something out and I come to a conclusion. How do I know that's true or not? And the result of this is that really it is only possible to come to truth if one moves from aql to qalb. That is, one moves from mind to the heart. And that is what Ghazali does when it comes to that breakdown that takes place. He goes off and he becomes a Sufi. And he comes to the conclusion that the only way that he can know that things are true is through the heart. And the heart is not the biological organ in our bodies. It is rather that quintessential part of a human that knows that things are true. It is part of the mystical experience of the Sufis that connect an individual to God in a mystical experience. That is the only way that Ghazali believes he can arrive at truth and therefore at peace of mind. Ghazali's impact is not just in terms of his objection to the philosophers, because ultimately I don't really believe that he did defeat the philosophers. In fact, theology after Ghazali continues to incorporate Avicennan philosophy, particularly Avicennan logic. So the logic of Avicenna was very much still part of the theology beyond Ghazali himself. And what later philosophy does, or theology does, is intertwine philosophy with it. So there is an intertwining of philosophy and theology after him. One of his bigger impacts, I think, is his impact on fiqh, on jurisprudence, because he really looked at the principles behind individual laws. If you remember, I was talking about that about 20 minutes ago. The idea that there are principles that underlie particular laws, and by working with those principles, one can come to formulate new legal tenets for new situations. And that is certainly something that he is able to his impact is felt through that. So to summarize Ghazali, the rationalists, that is those who use human reason, incoherent. Theologians who use dialectical reasoning are in many ways self-defensive in their argumentation. The traditionalists, those who use transmitted knowledge, open to error. That is, naql and khabar is always open to error. The legalists, legal interpretation of scripture, is a type of interpretation. And so the process by which, if you remember when we went through, well, my class went through Augustine, we saw a slow process of conversion. And at every stage, he moved to the next set of ideas, to the next text. We also see in Ghazali a process where he ultimately comes to the idea that only the heart can lead to attaining the truth. And more than this, I would conclude that what we have in Ghazali's thought as a second legacy, if we think of the first legacy being jurisprudence and his impact on Islamic law, I'd say his second legacy was not that he was particularly rejecting any particular field, although I focused a lot on his attack on philosophy. Tahafut al-falasifa actually means incoherence. That is, that he actually picks on particular topic areas or particular themes or subjects that he disagrees with the philosophers, but he doesn't throw out philosophy completely. For example, Avicenna logic, he believes anyone with any kind of mind, is going to accept logic, that logic is an important part of thinking. And so one of his works, Al-Qistas al-Mustaqim, although it is in fact an attack on the Ismailis, a Shiite sect, actually reflects in its title and in its prologue a very important concept of Ghazali's, which is balance. That it is very important to balance the different fields of learning, that one must not philosophize too much, or theologize too much, or reason too much, or pray too much, or do too much of one thing. And that what's most important is the idea of balance, and that is a central idea in the Islamic depiction of the Islam that he wishes to describe, particularly in his third great work, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, the revivification of the Islamic sciences. As for, in the last 5 minutes, I'll take a look at Ikhwan al-Safa. Now, Al-Qistas al-Mustaqim leads us naturally into this. Of course, Ghazali did not agree with the particular Ismaili Shia sect that the authors, the anonymous authors of the Ikhwan al-Safa, in fact, appear to have been, although that is not completely certain. Now, the Ikhwan al-Safa were slightly later, 10th century, well, pretty much contemporary, in fact. The Rasail are epistles, 52 in number, a kind of encyclopedia that covers many topics of the Islamic sciences that I've mentioned to you: mathematics, natural philosophy, psychology, also religious questions, and magic. It is a valuable window into the state of knowledge during this period. However, what is most interesting about the Rasail of the letters or the epistles of the Ikhwan al-Safa is that it is a merging of adab, what I have described to you a bit earlier, and philosophy. So the idea is that you now have a blend of philosophy and literature being reflected in these writings. Appropriation of philosophy for more eloquent literary production. For example, the particular epistle that you will be looking at is epistle 22, the case of the animals versus man before King before the king of the jinn. Now here we have a zoological fable, and the story is very interesting, that the animals consider that they are being oppressed by humans, and they have this neutral judge that they are complaining to. And the point about that is that they are trying to establish that they are equal to humans, and that therefore humans should not oppress them. And of course, the very interesting moment is the fact that you have a very favorable portrayal of animals, one of the most favorable portrayals of animals in Arabic literature. One thing is we see an echo in the title of the in the topic of the text itself, harking back to the very first text that I mentioned to you at the beginning of the session, the Kalila wa Dimna story. So here you have an extension, if you like, and a development of animal stories that we came across with Ibn al-Muqaffa. In this case, however, it is the humans who win because they have the prophets. Yes? Taking us back to the beginning of the CS course and prophecy. And of course, only humans have the prophets. But it's a very interesting comment, an indirect comment on humankind and the particular behaviors and misbehaviors of humankind. It is also, and I will conclude with this, as a text, as a collection of epistles, a very interesting and reflection of the Baghdad of the time. And here we have what it means to be educated from the 22nd epistle that you will be reading. What it means to be an educated individual in Baghdad. It means, and we here see, finally rose a learned, accomplished, worthy, keen, pious, and insightful man. He was Persian by breeding, Arabian by faith, a Hanif by confession, Iraqi in culture, Hebrew in law, Christian in manner, Damascene in devotion, Greek in science, Indian in discernment, Sufi in intimation, regal in character, masterful in thought, and divine in awareness. And here you have perfect blending of the philosophical adab that I was telling you about and a reflection of what becomes one of the most important aspects of Abbasid culture, that cosmopolitan, multicultural and multi-religious milieu that is being reflected here as the central tenet of education. And hopefully one day, if you graduate through all the CS courses, you will also be one such cosmopolitan, multilingual, educated individual. Thank you very much.